We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph in Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 19a. And the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a machlokas tanoim. Let's say you have a Nazir who becomes Tameh, and then he goes through the 7-day purification process. So at what point in time does he begin his new count of Nazirus? And the Chachamim said in the previous Amud that it goes by the carbon chatos, meaning to say he counts his 7 days of purification. Then on the 8th day he brings his set of karbanos. When he brings the carbon chatos, so at that point in time he can start counting his new Nazirus. But it is not dependent on the carbon asham. Even though he has not yet brought that carbon asham, still he can begin that new Nazirus count. And the Gemara says the Chachamim learned that from the following pasuk: Talmud Lomar v'Hazir v'Hevi. The pasuk says he starts his Nazirus and he brings that carbon asham, and the Chachamim understand it to mean Afal Pi Shelo Hevi Hazir. Even though he didn't yet bring his carbon asham, still he can start that new Nazirus. Rashi says Talmud Lomar v'Hazir la'Hashem es Yimei Nizro v'Hevi keves ben Shanaso li'Hasham lefikach hikdim hakasav v'Hazir la'Havas Hashama. The point is that the pasuk puts the word v'Hazir. The pasuk puts the word about beginning the Nazirus before it discusses bringing that carbon asham. Lomar lach natalyo afa pishlo hevi hazer, that even though he didn't yet bring that carbon asham, still he can start his Nazirus. That's the understanding of the Chachamim. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer, Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, he understands the pasuk differently. He says the pasuk means vehazer vehevi means Amosai Hazer. When does the Nazirus start? Bizman Shehevi. Only if he's already brought the carbon asham, meaning according to Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, the carbon asham is ma'akev. He has to bring that carbon in order to start his Nazirus. Rashi says, Amosai Hazer, Amosai Maschil Limnos Yimei Nazirus. At what point does he begin to count the days of Nazirus? Bizman Shehevi. That's only if he brought the carbon asham. And the Gemara continues, Man Tana Lahad Tanu Rabbanan. Who is the Tana of the following brisa? Isha Shanadra ben Nazir, let's say a woman vows to be a Nazir, v'nitman, she becomes Tameh, v'yachar ka'chefer labal, and afterwards her husband annuls her vow for her. Mevia chatas ha'of, so the brisa says she has to bring the carbon chatas, even though the vow was annulled. Ve'ena mevia ola ha'of, but she doesn't need to bring the carbon ola. Rashi over here explains, Man tana lahad tana rabbanon ha'isha shanadra, ve'ena mevia ola ha'of, leman itzrich lemisni de'ena mevia ola ha'of. What we mean to say is, according to who do we even need to teach that she doesn't bring the carbon ola? It seems obvious that she doesn't bring the carbon ola. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chisda says, Rabbi Yishmael, the author of this brayso says, Rabbi Yishmael ben Noshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. That's Rabbi Yishmael on the previous Amud, who says that we need a pasuk to teach us that the carbon ola is not ma'akev in terms of when the person starts the new Nazirus. The fact that we need a pasuk, that's also why it needs to be taught that she doesn't need to bring the carbon ola. Rashi says, Amar Rav Chisda Rabbi Yishmael, the l'didei chashav le'ola sa'of. According to Rabbi Yishmael, the carbon ola is important. That's why we needed a pasuk to exclude it. It may even have been ma'akev in terms of when to start the new Nazirus. The ila rabbanan, because according to the rabbanan, lo itzrich le'lemisni she'ena mevia ola sa'of. A brayso will need to teach us that she doesn't need to bring the ola sa'of. To ha'amrinan ola sa'of lo ma'akev, because we said before that the carbon ola is not even ma'akev in terms of when to start the new Nazirus, and you don't even need a pasuk for that. The lo asi ela mishum dorn bi'alma. The reason why you don't even need a pasuk is because it's just brought as a gift. It's obvious it's not ma'akev, and therefore upshita she'ena tzricha lahavi. It's obvious that she would not need to bring the carbon ola. It wouldn't even need to be taught. That's what the Gemara says again. Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, Rabbi Yishmael, he the author of that brayso says, Rabbi Yishmael ben Noshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. But the Gemara still says, my kasaver. But what exactly does Rabbi Yishmael hold over here that he's making this distinction between carbon chatas and a carbon ola? Ikasaver bal miakir okar. Now, if he holds that the husband, when he annuls the vow, completely uproots the vow from the beginning, from when it was taken, so chatas of nami lo laisi, there's no reason to bring the carbon chatas either. It's like she never took the vow in the first place. And he goes over Baal Megas guys. Now, if he holds that the husband annuls the vow from that point in time of the annulment going forward, but the vow still exists, she took the vow and she became Tameh, so then Ola Sa'of Nami Laisi, so then she should also bring the carbon Ola, because she was a Nazir who became Tameh. And so the Gemara answers, Liolam kasavar bal mi'akar. Really what he holds is that the husband does uproot this Nazirus, so it's as if the Nazirus never took place. And if that's the case, why do you have to bring any karbanos? Rabbi Yishmael savar like Rabbi Lazar HaKafar. The reason is because Rabbi Yishmael holds like Rabbi Lazar HaKafar. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Lazar HaKafar b'Rebbe Omer. Rabbi Lazar HaKafar b'Rebbe says, Ma'atam v'lomer v'chivar olav me'asher chata ala nefesh. Why does the pasuk say by a Nazir that he has to bring a kapara for the sin? V'chi be'ezer nefesh chata zeh. What sin did this Nazir commit? The sin is that he caused himself pain, he caused himself distress by preventing himself from having wine, and that is considered to be a sin. And so that's true over here as well. Anytime a person takes upon themselves a Nazirus, there is a sin involved, and that's why here also, where the woman had her vow annulled, she still needs to bring the karvan chatos for the sin. The kal v'chomer, it's a kal v'chomer. If this individual who only prevented himself from having wine is considered a sinner, so hamitzar atzmo mikol davar, let's say a person pains himself, puts himself in distress from all things, takes upon himself a voluntary fast, for example, alachas kama v'kama, how much more so is that considered to be a sin? And the Gemara notes, Nazir Tameksiv. The Gemara asks, isn't this pasuk by a Nazir who becomes Tameh? Nazir Tarkar, but we're saying over here, in this Braiser, Rabbi Elazar HaKafar is saying that any Nazir, even a Nazir who remains pure, is considered a sinner. So how could you bring a pasuk about a Nazir who becomes Tameh, that individual, it says, he calls him a sinner? How does that apply to a Nazir Tahar? And the Gemara answers, Kasav Rabbi Elazar HaKafar, it's because Rabbi Elazar HaKafar holds, Nazir Tar Nami Chotehu, that even a pure Nazir is a sinner. Why? V'hainu Taima, the reason is, V'hainu Taima D'chsiv B'Nazir Tameh, the reason the pasuk is written by a Nazir Tameh is Hol V'shana B'chet, is in a sense, he has repeated or extended the sin, because a Nazir Tameh is going to have to start his Nazirus all over. He's a Nazir for an even longer time. He's distressing himself by not having wine for an even longer time. That's why it mentions the sin by a Nazir Tameh, but the sin exists by the Nazir Tahar as well. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Yotza v'nichnas olin lo min haminyan. Let's say you have a person who declares that he's a Nazir in a cemetery, so the Nazirus does not start while he's in the cemetery, but it says if he left the cemetery, then he came back into the cemetery, so then those days count towards the Nazirus. And the Gemara questions the language of the Mishnah. Katani olin lo min haminyan. It says that he starts counting his days of the Nazirus. Mishum di yotza cholale Nazirus. The moment he leaves the cemetery, suddenly he's a Nazir. What about the purification process? And the Gemara answers, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says that's really what the Mishnah means. Kagon sheyotza v'hiza v'shana v'tava. The meaning of the Mishnah is, for example, he leaves the cemetery, he sprinkles on the third and the seventh day, he immerses himself, then he's pure. It means that from that point in time, that's when he starts counting the Nazirus. But still the Gemara questions the language of the Mishnah. Ela nichnas hu da'olin lo min haminyan. But the Mishnah says that not only does he leave the cemetery, but he enters back into the cemetery. It's only if he re-enters the cemetery that he's counting his Nazirus. Lo nichnas ein olin lo min haminyan. If he doesn't enter the cemetery, then he doesn't count the Nazirus. That doesn't make sense. And the Gemara answers, Lomi boy kamar. The Mishnah means to say not only this, but even this. Meaning to say, Lomi boy yatsa, not only in a case where he leaves the cemetery, he's then considered to be a Nazir Tar, he starts his count. Elafilo nichnas, even if he goes back into the cemetery, olin lo min haminyan, those days that he counted do count towards Nazirus. Rashi explains, Elafilo nichnas, the salka daitach tekev in the nichnas, one might have thought that if he re-enters the cemetery, Havale kimei karu, he goes back to what he originally was, shenazir v'hu beveis hakvar, it's just like a person who declares he's a Nazir while in the cemetery. V'lo yu olin lo min haminyan, and it shouldn't count towards Nazirus. V'lo chayla le Nazirus de tahara, you might think it's not even considered a Nazirus of purity. Kamash malon, that's what the Mishnah is teaching us. Kevan sheyotza v'hiza v'shana v'tava, once he left, sprinkled on both the third and seventh day and immersed himself, the havalei Nazir Tar, at that point in time he's considered a Nazir Tar. V'chayla ale Nazirus de tahara, the Nazirus of purity is chal on him. V'hadar itmi mevi karban tumah. The point is, then if he goes ahead and re-enters and becomes tameh, he has to bring a karban tumah for violating his pure Nazirus. And the Gemara continues, Amru lei Rav Kahana v'Ravasi l'Rav. Rav Kahana and Ravasi said to Rav, My time lo mefarshas lon kahalin mili. Why didn't you explain the Mishnah in this fashion like Shmuel just explained it above? Amar lahon, he said to them, Amina, because I said to myself, Dilma lo tzrichisu, maybe I don't need to explain it to you. It's obvious that that's how you explain the language of the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Eliezer says, Lo bo bayom, this halacha does not apply if the Nazir re-enters the cemetery on the same day that he became pure. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, V'hayamim harishonim yiplu, it says the first days they fall away and the Nazir has to restart his count of days of Nazirus. And we darshan from that pasuk at sheyiyu yamim rishonim. There have to be at least 2 days where he's a Nazir betara. In other words, the halacha applies when the Nazir becomes pure, and then for 2 days days he is a pure Nazir. Then if he re-enters the cemetery, then we say he's considered a Nazir that became Tameh. He goes through the process of purification. He starts the count over again. He brings that carbon tumah. But that does not apply if he was a pure Nazir for less than that amount of time and he immediately re-entered the cemetery. Then we wouldn't apply that halacha. And the Gemara says, Amar Ula says, Lo Amar Rabbi Eliezer ela b'tamish Nazir. This halacha of Rabbi Eliezer that you need 2 days of being a pure Nazir is only talking about by a Nazir who became a Nazir in the cemetery. He was impure when he declared the Nazirus in the first place. Aval ben Nazir tar, but let's say he declared himself a Nazir when he was pure, shenitma, and then he becomes tamei, afilu yom echad soser. Even if he was only a pure Nazir for 1 day, he goes into the cemetery, becomes tamei, that's going to undo the Nazirus. And the Rosh over here explains, Ela betame shenazir. Rabbi Eliezer's halach is by a impure nazir, meaning betame shehischel limnos nazir betara, meaning he declared the nazirus when he was tame, when he was in the cemetery. Then he began to count the nazirus. He purified himself. He began to count the days of purification, v'nitma b'zayin. And then on the day he became pure, that 7th day, when the Nazirah started, he becomes tamei immediately. In that case, Rabbi Eliezer says, she'eno mevi carbon tumah. He doesn't bring the carbon tumah in that case. Aval nazir tar shekibel alav Nazirus. But let's say you have a pure person who accepts upon himself Nazirus, v'nitma af b'yom echad, and he becomes tamei even on the first day, so sir, that would undo the Nazirus, heichad dechsiv, v'ayam v'rishonim yiplu. Then we would say, when do we say that the first days fall away? Kitami nizro, davka b'tami shenazir ba'inan yamim harishonim. Only by somebody who was impure and declared the Nazirus. Then we need first days. Then we need days in plural. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Tes Amud Beis.